wash Jiao offered yielded a blue fine as winter tea, patient and crystalline. She mixed it with rice, as her grandmother had taught, and then with a pinch of lacquer, watching as the mineral woke the way a lamp wakes moths. "We will have to go further into the method," Jiao murmured. "They test ash and trace. The auditors lift dust and send it east to the chemists in Shen's circle. We can't leave seams that speak of the southern ports. We must make colors that sing, and then forget their song." Mei Lin had read the edicts, audits on artisans, registry of merchants, stricter curfews. Names were being exchanged like dried seed. The network had frayed once with the courier's capture. She was not foolish enough to think secrecy alone would save them. But she had a stubbornness soon into her palms. "Teach me how to ensure the dust does not betray us," she said. Jia's first lesson was humility. "Bury the trace," he said. "Not in paper or in lies, but in practice. Use charcoal filters, tannin washes, and an ash that binds to heavy elements. Turn them into things that libraries and magistrates mistake for incense." He worked with the practiced arithmetic of a man who had compounded remedies and poisons both, and kept track of which had ruined lives. He demonstrated the ore slurry was boiled low with glutinous rice, then passed through char to catch metal flecks, then washed in the adhesive milk of boiled soy that sealed shards into a matrix. Finally, they dried pigments on strips of porcelain and stored them wrapped in leaves soaked in tea smoke that masked the mineral scent. The process dulled a trace but preserved a hue, a legal paradox. Mei Lin painted a tiny test swatch on the back of an old quart teacup. Under the lamp it vibrated softly. She thought of the emperor's hands, thin and unsteady, and how once color had made him stop, had made him recall the voice of someone lost to him. "We are not only hiding theft," she said. "We are making a thing that will be wearable in court, and yet leave no trail. They will have to look and remember rather than test and convict. And if they decide to remember by analysis," Jia asked, "if they set a chemist at the cup?" Mei Lin swallowed. The danger was always near enough to taste. "Then we teach other things," she replied. "We teach the court to treat color as ritual rather than commodity. We make narrative a shield." That was where scholar Lewei would come in. Lewei found them in a back alcove of the National Library, a place of dust and phosphorus candles, where scrolls sagged like hedgehogs and the keepers did not ask too many questions. He had a habit of slipping into rooms with his spectacles crooked as a private smile and a roll of paper tucked under his arm. He moved through marginalia the way a forager moved through a thicket, finding meaning in the spaces most people ignored. When he unfurled a sheet and laid out a catalogue of inventories with the careful cadences of an accountant, the numbers seemed like gentle ordinals in a prayer. He had taken to adding his own marginal songs, poems about ancient pigments, and in the spaces between entries he would bury names within metaphors that passed unnoticed to a hurried clerk. "If a man searches for lapis," he said softly, "and he reads only the verse, he will think he has found a poem. If he must read the margins to see the ore, the margin becomes a map only to those who know to look. We can bury directions in proverbs. No inquiry will take the time to untangle such knots." He handed Mei Lin a small folded sheet. On its face, the neat hand of an official inventory recorded common pigments: cinnabar, vermilion, lead white. In the margin, Lewei had slotted a line from an old elegy. Under the ink, he dotted small marks that corresponded to the way Jiao ground his ore. It was not just forgery. It was pedagogy and camouflage at once. "It will buy breath," Lewei said. "It will allow us to declare these works part of ritual code, not trade. Ritual cannot be taxed as mercantile sedition." Mei Lin read the lines and felt the slyness of it settle as a warm weight in her lap. She looked at the script and at Lewei, at how the scholar's voice trembled when he spoke of duty and stories. He had a belief she found almost embarrassing, that words could change the law's appetite. But if the court could be taught to think of pigments as sacrament, perhaps the Grand Secretary's logic of austerity might lose some of its teeth. Even as Lai Wei worked the archives, the emperor's recoveries were small and stubborn as a remnant moon. Consort Lion brought news in the afternoons between audiences. He hummed an old tune in the garden. He asked after a dog that had once shared his table. He turned and, in a moment that lit a whole room, called Lion by a nickname no one knew he still remembered. "Little Lotus," she said quietly when she told Mai Lin, pressing a folded cuff into the painter's hands. The cuff was keyed with minuscule stitches, the rose crimson that once used to make the emperor laugh. When he said that, he touched my sleeve as if to make sure the thread was still there. For a moment he was at the sea, not the hall. For a moment we were a household. Her voice bent with an affection that was both grief and tenderness. Mei Lin kept the cuff against her chest like a talisman. She could imagine the emperor's mind like a pond that had gone to silt. The pigments rattled on the surface, and sometimes the fish of memory would break the gopelp air. That was why concealment itself could not be the only strategy. If color provoked memory in the emperor, then the act of restoring color, framed as ritual, could become a binding force against the Grand Secretary's arithmetic of fear. In the workshop, Sun watched all this like a man discovering the world again. He arrived early and stayed late, sleeves rolled and hands quick and clumsy with the polish of youth. Zhao taught him how to weigh, not in numbers but in touch, the way a pinch of ash must feel like the weight of a song. The feeling in the wrist when the mortar began to hum. The way the brush should be held like a promise. "You will not boast of the color," Zhao told him. "You will not show it to friends who clap. You will not make it a thing of gossip. You treat it like a blade. You will respect its edge." Sun nodded until his head was a small pendulum of commitment. One night, Mei Lin set a tiny tray of pigment before him and asked him to prepare the wash. He worked as if worshipping. The scent of wet rice and boiled soy filled the room. His fingers trembled at the dilution. When he finally steadied his wrist and laid down a single hair-thin stroke across the back of a tea cup, the color took like a breath and Sun audibly let himself be astonished. "It is like the sea," he whispered. Mei Lin smiled, and for a moment she forgot the dangers that writhed beyond the lantern hallow. Protecting the emperor's memory had become, in her blood, a kind of domestic piety. She began to hum the old ancestral refrain she had learned from her grandmother, while grinding soft syllables keyed to rhythm and grain, and she taught the tune to Sun, so that he would associate recipe with song. Recipe would not be only ink. It would be memory. If ever he were forced to speak, perhaps the song would be the last thing in his mouth. But the court's shadow moved like a low mist. Eunuch Rong's visits were regular and contained more than the small courtesies of a servant. He brought news of increased audits, of Shen's emissaries combing the merchants along the salt roads. He told them of a magistrate who had been offered a 12-year inventory of pigment shipments and had gone pale at the pattern of one buyer. The circles of suspicion contracted like a tightening fist. Rong's eyes were soft in a man who had to make hard decisions. He spoke as if choosing which small thing to leave untouched could shift the whole balance. "Some will hold you," he said. "Others will make bargains. I have seen secret pacts blossom into treachery." Mei Lin thought of the courier captured on the back road, and her stomach knotted. The safety they had purchased with secrecy had cost them a life somewhere. Zhao did not hide the pain that sometimes crossed his face. In a low voice, he told a story. Years earlier, a batch of pigment had failed to bind in a village that had then been accused of witchcraft. Men had been flogged, women taken, and a child had died. He had carried the guilt like a stone. "We will not do that again," he said simply. "We change method. We lessen harm, we do what we can." The lesson turned practical. They became alchemists of delay. They painted surfaces that would look vivid in daylight, but whose composition would collapse under chemical curiosity into harmless tannins. They employed binders that scented the pigment with tea smoke, so the bench tests would assume mere domestic residue instead of southern mineral. when Li Wei's falsified inventories were combined with the smoke-washed residues. Even inspectors who loved their arguments found themselves wandering away like men hypnotized by a lullaby. For a time it seemed cleverness could match the court's appetite. Yet cleverness demands a toll. Each measure required labor and thus people to labor. Each mask tightened the knot of who knew what. Mei Lin watched Xun at night, hand-stained, and felt the earliest trace of dread that secrecy breeds not loyalty but dependence. One misstep from a child, one word spilled under fear, and the whole network could unravel. She thought of her grandmother's song, and how often it hid warnings in its cadence lines about not leaving breadbite by the door, lest the wrong mouse find the larder. The song, she told herself, was as important as the pigment. There were happier nights. The Emperor began to have small recoveries more often. Consort Lion came to the workshop once, under pretext of bringing saved thread, and brought back a precise story. The Emperor had gone into the garden and sat with his hands in his lap, watching a pair of house sparrows arguing over a crumb. He had hummed something at length, a chime that was clear for a minute, and called Lion Little Lotus without prompting. Lion's eyes shone with a private warmth that made the lanterns look like gossiping moths. When he named me that, she said, some small part of him crossed back over the river. I do not know if we keep him, but we get him back in pieces. In response, Mei Lin painted a small pocket scroll, just enough to hang near the Emperor's reading chair and embroidered child's room, low beds angled toward a window. A small dog asleep, a sky made from the southern blue. She used the concealed wash, the tannin and ash, and she wrapped the scroll in old tea leaves, because tea smoke had become their friend. The day the attendant unrolled it before the Emperor, his hand trembled for a moment, and then steadied, as if steadying a memory. He reached out as if to touch a ghost and closed his fingers on nothing, but his breath came deeper. For a day the palace woke as if from a bad dream. People walked straighter and laughed in small ways they had abandoned. They found themselves singing fragments of a court song no one had dared sing since the purge. Such days were the reward and the ruin. Rewards because the work proved what Mei Lin had always believed. Color could call back a mind. Ruin because the reward made people remember other things, what it felt like to be joyous, what it felt like to want, and desire often breeds politics. Grand Secretary Shen, for all his rationalities, had a human stomach. He saw the laughter as a spoil he could not abide. Rumor traveled faster than ink. The auditors grew suspicious of the pattern. Sudden recoveries, odd shipments of tea leaves, a network of artisans suddenly busier than the edicts allowed. One night as Mei Lin left Jiao's workshop, the courtyard smelt of rain though none had fallen. Lanterns bowed in a soft wind. She had stayed late to train Xun in wrapping and binding pigments in the way they now needed tea leaves soaked in tannin then pressed like letters. Porcelain pieces wrapped in graduated cloth. Jiao walked her to the gate and rested a hand for a moment at the small of her back, a gesture older than both of them. "Watch the door," he said, and the words held a quiet command. Unit Rong met her at the outer gate, and his expression was closed. "They are sending a new inspector next week," he said, an old man from the Southern Archives, new to Shen's confidence. "He has a nose for oddities and the authority of the Grand Secretary behind him. They say he questions women's workshops more than he should." Mei Lin nodded. The name meant little until she pictured an old man with a lantern flicking across a table, his fingers reaching for a seam. "We will adjust," she said, though even she felt the word fragile as a thin cup. When she returned to the narrow street that ran between the salt warehouses and the kiln yard, she found a single scrap of paper pinned to the gate of Gio's workshop with a shard of pottery. It was the sort of small thing that could be a whim ragged at the edge, as if cut by a hurried hand. She stooped and read the short line in an unfamiliar calligraphy. "We watch." No name, no flourish, just the bluntness of a watchman's baton. Mei Lin felt a chill go through her that had nothing to do with night air. She kept the scrap pocketed against her heart, where it warmed like a new bruise. For a moment she feared the note meant nothing more than a warning from Grand Secretary Shen's emissaries. For another moment she thought of more personal betrayals, someone in their circle moved by fear. A man in a market booth who had once loved another man's laughter and now sold out to keep his family. The note could be a threat, a taunt, or a misdirection. There was no way to tell. She folded it carefully and walked the long way home, avoiding the palace streets where lantern holders conversed with the constancy of men who keep secrets in the way others keep time. Xun had followed her from the workshop, pretending to tie his shoe, then fell to her side like a sudden weather. He produced a small bundle of leaves diaphanous with tea and presented them as if they were an offering. "We will practice the wash harder so the inspector cannot tell," he said with the untempered zeal of youth. Mei Lin put a hand on his shoulder. The touch was small, but it grounded her to the human costs of what they did. She looked up at the sliver of moon and thought of the listless sea of memory that was the emperor. She thought of the scrolls in Li Wei's hands and the small songs she had taught Sun to sing when he mixed pigment. She thought of Jiao's story about a village and a child. The note in her pocket felt like the beginning of a conversation that could not be returned. She understood then that they had bought time with craft and cunning, but not immunity. Each ingenious method raised the bar of suspicion. Each friend who sheltered them risked a name. The web would not hold if a single strand was suddenly pulled away. The next day Li Wei would press a forged ledger into the chest of a small official who loved his evening wine. The emperor would hum in the garden. Xun would practice a wash until his wrist learned the rhythm of restraint. At night they would meet again under Jiao's salt smoke beams, grinding and singing and binding and disguising the southern blue until it refused to betray them. Mei Lin folded the scrap of paper and slipped it into her journal, under a page of notes where she had recorded a recipe in song. She wrote the date above it, and then a line from her grandmother's melody. "Keep the color like a sleeping bird, do not blow on it lest it wake and fly into danger." She closed the journal and walked on. Behind her, in the courtyard, a single lantern guttered and then steadied, as if the world had chosen, for now, to go on. The watchword on her skin and the note in her pocket would follow them to the workshop the next night, and the night after that. Someone was watching. Someone else would be taught to watch back. The chest was smaller than Mei Lin expected, no great trunk of ceremony, but a cedar box the size of a scholar's lexicon, its corners rubbed to a pale softness. Consort Lion set it between them with reverence, as if placing an altar on the low table. The lid opened with a sigh, and a scent rose that was not only camphor but thyme, the resinous hush of wood that had held breath for decades. The dry sweetness of old silk, the faint iron of memory that hung like a thread across the room. Mei Lin found herself leaning forward, not out of prying but because the things inside called for the smallness one needed to see detail. The pieces were not meant for display, fragments of cuffs and hems, tiny squares of embroidered cloth, a collar lined with stitches that had survived years of washing and neglect. Some were nearly unrecognizable, once bright blues washed to slate, gold stitched as if mere suggestions of light. A crimson so faded it read as brown until seen from a single angle. Each fragment had a story, and Lion seemed to have come to the end of her patience for keeping the stories shut away. They mattered, Lion said, her voice folded in on itself as if she were reading from an old script. She reached in and brought out a scrap no larger than the palm of Mei Lin's hand, a square of linen with the ghost of a rose worked into it. The stitches were fine, patient. The center, where once a petal must have been ablaze, was now the color of old tea. Lion held it so gently Mei Lin felt that even the air around the cloth might bruise if they were not careful. Mei Lin lifted the scrap into the light, letting the morning through the latticed window find the bareness of thread. It mapped itself in her eyes like a small geography the way the silk had been layered over the linen. The tiny split where a novice's needle had missed, and the stitch had been corrected by a later hand. There was a rhythm here, she thought, the rhythm of a life spent doing the quiet work of making beauty stick to a surface people used without noticing. She thought of her grandmother's small singing as she ground ore with rice, the song that hid a recipe, the lullaby of measures and times. He loved roses, Lion said, a confession rather than information. Her fingers brushed the edge of the scrap the way one would touch a sleeping animal. He told 1,000 stories of gardens when we were young in the inner courtyards. Once he said he would plant a grove. He never did. There was always a summons, a petition, someone with a fever. But the talk of gardens never left him. He would hum under his breath, and we would pretend not to hear. It is she broke off and pressed the scrap to her chest. Mei Lin set the piece on the table. Her hands hesitated only a breath before she reached for the small box of pigments hidden within her robe's sleeve. They were the pilfered things of a clandestine practice, a pinch of fulsome red, not the harsh vermilion sold for banners, but the old dye that softened rather than shouted. A powder of iron that could be tempered to a warmth, a luster that could be coaxed from an ox blood pigment with patient, washed glue. She did not plan a transformation. She planned a conversation between thread and color to lay a single note where the world once trembled. "May I?" she asked. Lion did not answer, only inclined her head with the quiet of a woman who had navigated courtship and conflict as if they were stitches in a hem. Mei Lin unrolled her silk cloth, a clean white strip she used to test brush flow, and ground a breath of pigment between her thumb and the flat of a stone. It was enough that the color should not be heavy, only insinuate itself into the worn fibers. Her brush, older than she felt, moved as if obeying muscle memory from childhood lessons handed down through hands that had known scarcity and secrecy. The first touch of crimson was small, a breath over the center of the rose. It did not jump the way a new paint could. Rather, it sank, seeped into the hole where the silk had been thinned by time, tethering to the thread as if remembering how to be vivid. Lion watched without the performative composure common to court watchfulness, her fingers twined together, knuckles pale. Mei Lin worked in silence, her breathing a metronome, adding a wisp here, a feather there, knowing that overwork would cheapen the effect. She relied on restraint, on the lesson of her grandmother. Color should be coaxed to say what the maker meant, not to overwhelm the eye. When the touch was done, the rose was not remade into a new thing. It remained a relic, but one that now kept a line of the old heat. Lion brought the cloth to her face, held the rose like a small offering, and for a long time did not speak. Tears came then slow and hot, and Lion let them fall. "He told me once," she whispered at last, "that red was the color of promises. Not the loud ones at court, but the quiet ones that keep a person from breaking in half. He said, keep them close, make a red for each vow, and then he would forget the vows, but not the color. When I hold this, I remember the vows more than he does. I remember the way he fixed me with a look and said, 'Do not be reckless with your hands, Lion,' and her voice thinned. I think I answered that with my needles." Mei Lin did not offer platitudes. She understood that this was not the relief of a restored object, but the making whole of a place in Lion's life where a name had fallen away. When Lion folded the scrap into her palm, she did it with the tenderness of a person returning a child to itself. "There is more," Lion said. The candor in her voice had the shape of a door opening wider than expected. She set the scrap back into the chest, as if it were sleeping. "You are not the first to touch these things. No one else can be trusted with them. Not the women that carried them, not the eunuchs that run errands. They are memory and shame both. I have hidden them where the palace's eyes rarely come. They were my insurance against forgetting. But you have hands that know how to argue with color. There are rooms you should see. There are boxes that will make your work less a repair and more a restoration of a life. Mei Lin felt the weight of Lion's offer like a stone dropped into quiet water. "If I help," she said carefully, "I become a ledger for more than pigment. I carry names and debts. It will make me exposed." Lion's mouth curved. "It will make you necessary. It will also make you a target. Do not imagine otherwise. But there are times when being necessary is worth the risk. You should know what you are defending." They left the women's hall the way conspirators leave a theater after a private performance, softly, with practiced avoidance of eyes. Lion guided Mei Lin down back stairs that smelled of moss and the faint soreness of old incense. The palace here was a geography of shadows and corners, balustrades polished to different degrees by hands that had passed them in different decades. Doorways with panels faded to varying shades, depending on whether youths or elders had brushed them, latticework that cast 1,000 small maps of light on the floor. The alcove Lion led her to was behind a false panel in a room used for storing ceremonial offerings when the palace had more festivals. The lock yielded to a key that had lived in Lion's sleeve for years, and the door opened onto a shallow space lined with boxes, each labeled with a calligraphy that read more like a reminder than a ledger: childhood, spring, the gift from the south. The air in the alcove was cooler, the light a dim amber that made the dust motes visible like tiny planets in a private sky. The objects inside were not grand: a child's low bench worn smooth by feet, a lacquer comb with a missing tooth, a scrap of blue silk stained with a pattern of waves, so old the dye had sunk into the weave, like a memory settling into bone. Mei Lin took each item as if learning languages she had not studied. She let her fingertips map the pucker of a seam, the faded nap of thread, the way a needle hole held a residue of pigment that could tell her what red had once been. Once she had touched something, the past rearranged itself in her mind with new clarity, a voice calling from the courtyard at dusk, the clatter of a tray carried in haste, the way a boy might have tied a jade bead to a cord and kept it under his pillow. These were private landmarks. To restore a color to an object was to give the emperor the chance to sail back for a breath across the decades of his life. Lion watched her with an intensity that was almost maternal. He would sometimes place small things in the alcove and pretend he had forgotten them. Then, later, he would find them and look surprised as if discovering mercy in the world. "I kept them because I hoped he would discover the mercy again on his own." Mei Lin felt the scale of Lion's stewardship like a responsibility being offered in a fragile basket. Her journal, the paper book she kept under her palette, pages full of swatches and notes, seemed inadequate. She had not considered how much of history was stored in a hem, how many loyalties could be stitched into the edge of a cuff. If she accepted the trust, she would be reweaving more than color. She would be reconstructing moments that could change how the emperor saw his present. "Will you let me return pieces as they are, or do you want them changed back to how they were?" Mei Lin asked. Lion looked at her as if the question carried the same weight as asking whether it was better to speak truth or lie to a dying person. "I don't want to revise the past, Mei Lin. I only want what was simple again. If he remembers the small things, the warmth of a sleeve, a line of a poem, that is enough. You do not have to remake a tapestry into a banner. You simply have to make the face of a rose hold the memory it used to hold." Mei Lin nodded. It was not a small ask. It required a kind of humility and acceptance that her art was to be a quiet conduit rather than a flamboyant miracle. She had always measured herself against the unspoken standards of her grandmothers who disguised recipes and songs in nursery rhymes. This was the same work but with higher stakes. They fell into a rhythm. Lion would fetch an object, Mei Lin would examine it, and they would talk. The conversation was not all about the emperor. Lion spoke, in fragments, about banquets where lantern light made 1,000 trembling constellations across a room, about the way the emperor once punched his palm when scandal had threatened to take a life, about the quiet of mornings when he would forget the names of ministers, but remember the name of his brother's favorite crab. These were small things, not policy.